Welcome back to a live episode of the Daily Wrestling News Show, where we are on a mission to teach, learn, and remember the history of professional wrestling with everyone that wants to join us. My name is Ryan Joy, and it's a special episode. It's our 9th special episode as we kind of react and recap the Tales from the Territory episodes. And with me today, as always, is Mr. John DeConnie.
Good morning, sir. How are you this morning?
Very good. Very good. This episode, I enjoyed this episode. I feel like the luster has fallen off of the Tales from the Territory a little bit, because I really liked like the early episodes, the Memphis and the Kaufman episode, and the AWA. These ones, I was familiar with all the characters, but I didn't feel like I learned quite as much.
Yeah, and we had a discussion last week about like, oh, they're doing Crockett at number 9. What's 10 going to be? 10, that's the finale. It's how is Crockett not the finale? I think maybe it's because the stories, obviously they knew what they had in the can.
Yeah.
Not only do they have a killer lineup for next week in terms of who's sitting down at the table, but I'm guessing maybe they've got some really good stories, because the Crockett stories, there were 2 big ones, but like you said, there were kind of ones that maybe you already know, and they just got a little further in detail with them. But, clearly Crockett was the biggest and best of the territories next to New York that would become WWE. But maybe they felt like the stories just weren't there.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, right? The fact that Crockett was sort of a national company.
Yeah.
And then definitely became national. So, I think Jim Cornette said on this episode that Crockett was the only real competition to Vince McMahon in the 80s, and WCW, which was the successor, was the only real competition to Vince in the 90s. So perhaps the reason this one didn't quite have the luster is because we kind of know a lot of this history already. And it was national, whereas the territories were like they were territories, so they were very regional stories that we hadn't really been exposed to quite as much. So, yeah, that's kind of the way I perceive my the way I take it. But you brought up next week, so let's just next week they're doing Mid-South for the finale. It's episode 10. They do have quite a panel. They have Jim Ross, Michael Hayes, Jake Roberts, and Ted DiBiase. So really big names in the history of WWE and everything. So I mean, Michael Hayes is not really a big name in the history of WWE, but he's been with the company now for like 20 years in a backstage role. Maybe it's almost 30 years now, actually. So you and I talked last week. Why wasn't Michael Hayes in the Texas episode? Well, maybe they just didn't want to reuse him, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, and I get a text from Ryan last night because we had that conversation. Oh, next week is Mid-South, and they've got Michael Hayes. Oh, okay. And I'm just getting into the territories episode because I was doing some other stuff and whatnot, so I started late. I get to the end of the episode, and I see the cast, and I'm like, hey, at this point, it's too late to text him. I don't want to wake him up. Jesus, way to bury the lead.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Jim Crockett Promotions is really the Mid Atlantic territory of the National Wrestling Alliance. They operated from 1935 to 1985, and then it was sold off to WCW. I guess I'm trying to remember who it was that said they went from basically small buildings to auditoriums. And then when they got really hot, they went and had, a football stadium type of thing. So it's fun to look at these territories and just see how territory is almost, these days, to have a big show that requires a football field of any kind, or even a baseball stadium. You got to be national, because wrestling just isn't as popular or isn't as mainstream, I suppose, in the each location. So you have to have people traveling in. But in this territory days, as we've seen throughout several of the episodes, they were able to fill relatively big buildings.
Yeah, that's what Crockett was so special in that way, because it was the Carolina territory, but they could basically go anywhere in the South, and even occasionally, just kind of blipped up north. And yeah, they were selling out wherever they went on the backs of the Horsemen and Flair, and of course
Dusty.
Dusty. And yeah, they would sell out just about anywhere they went. They were kind of national without even really trying to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and they became a talent magnet in the same way that the WWE was. They had all kinds of talent at that time, and you start listing off the names, and you're like, yeah, no, those are all very, very recognizable names. You're like you mentioned the Horsemen and the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette and Lex Luger. These guys that were just super, super big names in those days. The way they organized this episode, it was really around the villains, the heels of the territory. Uh, it's lots of stories about Jim Cornette. Some people have probably heard lots of story. They focused on Nikita Koloff. They focused on the basically formation of the Horsemen with the Flair and turn on Dusty in the cage. So they were really focused in on heels with this episode.
That was the evil heels of the Carolinas was the subtitle. So yeah, you knew it was based around the heels, and I didn't realize. I did. It must have been the Starcade '85 episode that I did in this month. So yeah, it had to have aired in the last week or so. Uh, the Dusty finish.
Yes.
What led up to that was the formation of the Horsemen, and I was kicking myself last night. There was another story they went over that I'm sure you'll get to, where I basically had covered just as much as they had to say, maybe even a little bit more. But in the episode about the formation of the Horsemen, that cage match where the Koloffs attacked Flair, Dusty came to the rescue, and then the Andersons came to back up Flair, and he turned on Dusty. Flair was the babyface champ, and of course Dusty was a big babyface, but I knew that was a turn. I knew that was the unofficial birth of the Horsemen. Everything that I got into didn't quite touch on how dramatic it was.
Yeah.
As they referred to it last night as the riot at the Omni, because and Arn Anderson said in no uncertain terms that was the one night in his life he wasn't sure if he was going to make it out alive. So
In the
wow.
golden age of professional wrestling, when the wrestling business was protected and the passionate fans still believed. Yeah, that's the intro to these every territory episode that Dwayne the Rock Johnson says, and to that's exactly it. We have a couple of stories in every episode about how committed to kayfabe and their gimmicks they were, and we have a couple of stories about how the fans almost killed people. So in this case, you brought up they talked about the story of the heel turn of Flair and how the fans were climbing. It was a cage match, and the fans climbed the cage and they were knocking the fans off the cage, and then luckily there were like 10 or 11 policemen that came and kind of got the fans backed up enough to where the heels, the Andersons and Flair, could get out of the cage, but then they still had to run the gauntlet to the back. Right. And Arn Anderson, who was on the panel, said, we were all bleeding, we were all hurt, and none of it was from the match. Wow. So case in point proven with this episode about how the fans still believed.
And getting back to your comment about how kayfabe is a part of every episode, they also kind of dropped in a line at the end there. And throughout the whole thing, Dusty continued to sell that he was beaten and didn't move inside the cage.
he wasn't going to help him. Flair and the Andersons get out of there. He was going to watch him suffer. I guess I would want to be a babyface in those days.
That's for damn sure.
Well, and the other one to your the same type of thing. At one point, Ricky Morton was talking. Because Ricky Morton was also on the panel about Jim Cornette and how he just got so much heat, and he was, a lot of people hate him to this day, but in those days, it was less for his
political points of view.
He in those days he was hated really by everybody. But Ricky Morton, who would be opposite Jim Cornette, wrestling the Midnights or whoever, he would like be selling in the middle of the ring, but he would like keep one eye open so that he could watch Jim Cornette get assaulted by the fans. So-
And you know what? I remember in one of the episodes where they were talking about how they used, the Iran issue that was going on to sell a heel here and this, that, and the other. It's amazing what they were willing to do. The one episode where, oh, your father was a prisoner of war and he was a prisoner of war twice. Gee, what a loser! Like going after an American soldier, and that
yeah.
just kind of like blew me back. To your point, Cornette, in his role as the manager of the Midnight Express, at one point with the famous tennis racket, a shot to the gut of Baby Doll.
Right.
And it wasn't enough that he assaulted a woman who, was a terrible heel herself, but also at one time at this point was a baby face and was as over as you could be. And the dastardly heel, not only did a man hit a woman, they sold it because he hit her in the gut, that because of that shot, she in all likelihood would never have children.
And Cornette just leans into it.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, and Cornette leans into it. Well, who wants something that looks like that reproducing? Like, holy crap.
They talked about, Jim Cornette got his start working as a photographer for Memphis for Jerry Jarrett. And Jerry Jarrett would tell Cornette, if you can get the fans to hate you half as much as you can get the locker room here to hate you, we're going to make millions of dollars. That's the sort of how Jim got into the business. So it's kind of fun.
And he absolutely did, because they were kind of, him and the Midnight Express were kind of hated just as much behind the scenes as they were in front of the cameras. There was the mention.
So the panel here for this episode was Arn Anderson, Ricky Morton, Baby Doll, David Crockett. But they also, for the first time, had sort of a panel that wasn't co-located, and they weren't conversing back and forth, but they were contributing to the story. So they had Jim Cornette sort of singularly interviewed, and they also had Nikita Koloff singularly interviewed, and they would kind of intersperse them into here. And that's really the first time that they had done this. And I don't know if they were recycling footage or they had a conversation with Jim about something else, because they're doing Dark Side of the Ring right now, and maybe they said, okay, well, while we have you, can we get you to comment on this story or that story? Possible that's kind of what they were going for.
Yeah, that was a nice touch, because we got, we had 4, maybe 5 people around the table for most episodes. This, you were able to pull in a 5th and a 6th person, and without overcrowding the table, if you will, and whatever.
And it really added, I thought, a lot to the episode, especially since Arn Anderson is, he cuts great promos in wrestling, but when you hear him in this sort of setting, he's always very soft spoken. It doesn't say a lot, and what he does say, he is usually very like poignant.
Yeah.
So, my reason for saying that is I don't think like a full hour-long thing where Arn Anderson is the featured guy is going to be something that's going to keep your attention. But inserting these other characters was really good for this episode. There's a lot of stories about Jim Cornette. The Night of the Skywalkers, which was another Starcade, and the whole story about Jim Cornette falling from the scaffolding. Didn't realize that Big Bubba Rogers was involved there until last night. So, John, we're going to have to, for this Daily Wrestling News Show, just go back and watch all the Starcades and do kind of a series on that, because I think that'll be fun for us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We'll stop when the WWE started doing them, because those were house shows, basically.
Right.
But the other thing we talked about, the fans believing and stuff like that, and the way they stuck to kayfabe. Jim Cornette said that you would always err on the side of getting hurt versus being safe, because if you were too safe and it didn't look good, then they wouldn't buy tickets and nobody would believe. The other thing is this whole origin story for Nikita Koloff I found to be pretty fascinating. And here's a guy who he got the call from Jim Crockett. He's from Minnesota. He's a football player. He gets a call from Jim Crockett. He returns the call and he says, "Look, I don't have any amateur wrestling background. I don't have any professional wrestling training. Are you okay with this?" And Jim Crockett says, "Yes." And Nikita's like, "Okay, so what's the next thing? Be in my office on one day or whatever, and have your head shaved." And so this is like, so I guess basically Nikita Koloff gets his marching orders. He's going to be Ivan Koloff's nephew, and he's not going to speak English. He's going to be the Russian nightmare, and he, people have probably seen plenty of Nikita Koloff matches. They've probably seen promos. They've seen this kind of thing, vignettes. Nikita Koloff stayed in character 100% of the time.
Yeah, he really lived his gimmick.
He,
Go ahead.
Arn Anderson told the story of seeing him in the gym and being kind of put off a little bit because he would walk up to Nikita and Nikita would, he didn't speak any Russian. He just gibberish and used like the Russian accent that, the stereotypical thing. He would walk up, Arn Anderson would walk up to him and, Nikita would blow him off and say something in gibberish. And Anderson's like, "Oh, what's up with this guy?"
Yeah, at first he was pissed off, and then he came to the realization, well, there's a guy living his gimmick, so good for him.
Yeah.
But
and then Cornette told the story that it was Anderson who finally said to him in the locker room, because he wouldn't break kayfabe in the locker room, "Listen, dude, we know you're from Minnesota."
Hey, listen, Scott Simpson. we know you're from Minnesota. Yeah, and he almost, thank God again at the time, it was okay for a heel to just be a dick, in regular everyday life, because Nikita Koloff told the story of him being, he went shopping one day and a random grocery clerk walked up to him and started speaking fluent Russian, or what he perceived to be fluent Russian, because again, he spoke none. He got by on grunts and a half-ass accent. Well, I'm sure it was a good accent, but he got by without being able to say much.
Right.
And this kid came up to him, and I'm assuming probably said something to the effect of, "Pleased to meet you," or "I'm from Mother Russia," or something like that. And Koloff, I guess, kind of panicked for a half a second, and then went like, "It doesn't matter. I can just be a jerk," and kind of grunted at him and walked away from him. But again, just like in previous episodes where, kids got shoved or punched for asking a heel for an autograph at a liquor store, it was okay to just walk away and be a jerk. You're a heel, and that, you live in that gimmick every minute of every day.
The best story, it was not related, rest Nikita Koloff story for me, not related to the kayfabe piece, is that I didn't realize that he auditioned to be Drago in Rocky IV. That was awesome. That would have been really cool.
And he was turned down for essentially the greatest reason anyone could be turned down for a part.
Yeah.
You're just too big. You're just too imposing. And, Sylvester Stallone, is in a shadow when you walk near him.
I know, that's really too bad, because that would have been a really cool wrestling connection. It would have been the second big wrestling connection in the Rocky movies, because Hogan was in 2, I think, Rocky 2.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So, the other kayfabe thing, his daughter's birth certificate says that he's from Lithuania.
Yes. Yes, he at that point had given up. And like, hey, look, nobody remembers Scott Simpson other than my mother, father. So moving forward, I'm Nikita Koloff. It doesn't matter. Okay, maybe I've learned a little English, whatever you want to say, but I'm going to be Nikita Koloff. And yeah, like you said, it even extended to his daughter's birth certificate.
Yeah. Okay, so the other thing that they talked about on this episode that was sort of the iconic story is that plane crash. And John, did you have the episode handy of the one that you wrote about that plane crash?
It was for October 4th. I don't remember what the episode number was, but
episode 47, what 1975 event nearly changed wrestling forever. So, yeah. So I think that was the crux of your story too, wasn't it? The whole
That was 100% of the story, and kind of what they really leaned into last night was kind of the very end of my story, where it was supposed to be a quick 45-minute jump, to Charlotte, right to the coast, and David Crockett again told the story of how he wasn't even supposed to be on the plane. He was filling in for his brother, who was just a little under the weather, and because it was such a short trip, he decided to be on it. And the thing that really played into last night was how Tim Woods, who wrestled under the white mask as Mr. Wrestling, and Ric Flair, they said last night, like, oh, he saved wrestling in the Carolinas with what he did. Ric Flair has gone on record, I think, in his own book and in multiple interviews to say he saved wrestling, perhaps all of wrestling, because Tim Woods was the number one babyface in the promotion. The rest of the plane, other than David Crockett, who was a promoter, was all heels, including the number one and number two heels in the company in Valentine, who was I think the North American champ or something like that at the time, and Ric Flair, a young Ric Flair, albeit, but Ric Flair. So a plane goes down with nothing but heels in it, plus the top babyface. This would have upset the wrestling world to no end. So probably barely conscious, Tim Woods thinks to give his name to reporters and doctors on the scene, already thinking ahead, as George Wooden, his birth name.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That goes into the papers, and nobody bats an eye for a moment. But because he's listed as a promoter in the newspaper stories, people start to look into it, because obviously, I guess everyone knows everyone around there, and there's no promoter named George Wooden, blah blah blah. So they dig into it a little bit, and people start to be rumblings that was that Tim Woods, the number one, and exactly the nightmare scenario is unfolding. The number one baby face was on a plane with the number one heel. That just doesn't happen, blah blah blah. And it's, I think, 2 weeks after the fact. Woods was one of the people who took the least amount of damage, but again, it was a goddamn plane crash. So he's got badly bruised, if not broken ribs. It hurts to breathe, but he puts on the white mask and wrestles in intense pain, just to sell the fact that, well, how could I have been in a plane crash? Here I am wrestling, 2 weeks later. And
Yeah.
Ric Flair says that he saved wrestling in that moment.
Did they, based on your research that you did for that episode that we did they soften the plane crash at all? Like somebody died, right? The pilot died, right? Because they didn't talk about that.
Exactly. Yeah, the pilot died like maybe 2 months later, but I think he was in a coma that whole 2 months. And of course, Valentine never walked again.
Yeah.
So Flair broke his back. Somebody else broke their back. David Crockett, like 2 days later, like his head went through the seat in front of him. It was, and all this, except now Crockett said last night that his seat did not dislodge. Everything I read said that all the seats dislodged, and that's why Valentine broke his back in the front seat, because he had actually he switched seats with Flair.
Right.
When they came off the ground, Flair was right next to the pilot and started getting a little weirded out by how good of a seat he had to watch what was going on out the window. And I guess he bitched and moaned enough that Valentine just went, come back here, and switch seats with him. And as they were going down, the engine sputtered, and Valentine kind of looks over and turns around and goes, we're out of gas. Like he did not see the emergency in what was happening. And then, according to Flair, they fell out of the sky like a stone.
Oh, that's just such a crazy story. Such a crazy story. But those are the legendary stories from the territory, and a lot of those that we talked about, people already knew, but there's some nuggets in there of cool things. And I could listen to Ricky Morton talk for a long time. So That was fun.
Yeah, as long as it's about the past, I could listen to Jim Cornette talk for hours. So
Exactly. I don't ever want to hear him talk about the present product. It's just I clash too much with his uh, with him. But but when he talks about the past, I mean he was just so perfect for that era, and he recalls it so well.
and yeah, he's a historian for that era and further back. So yeah.
Yes. Yes. All right. That said, next week it'll be our last special for this. Right. We're going to be talking. It'll be DW Daily Wrestling News Show number 10, special number 10, Tales from the Territory. We're going to be talking about Mid South. John, anything else from this episode that you wanted to shout out before we get out?
Just how Tully Blanchard almost got Ricky Morton killed. that was kind of like a real quick story right at the end. Tully Blanchard got his life together. He found God, and he appears on the 700 Club. And Ricky Morton's at home with his wife. It happened to be a day off, and his wife, oh, your buddy Tully is on the television. Let's watch him. And as he's telling his own redemption story, Tully outs Ricky Morton, basically saying, the two of us had, coke and whores every night in our locker room, in our hotel room. And Morton just kind of like goes white as a ghost and kind of looks over his wife and sees the smoke coming out of her ears. And, it was good for a chuckle, last night on the show, but I'm sure in reality it was a lot worse.
Morton said that was the end of his marriage.
Yeah.
So, and she grew horns apparently in that moment. So, yeah, you're right. It was a good. It was funny that was kind of like lodged in there right at the end. But I guess, Tully was a great heel on camera, and I guess he healed Morton's marriage there. So. But all right, that said, we'll see everybody next week. Before we get out of here, John, what's coming up on the Daily Wrestling News Show here? It's the last day of the month of November. Who won their final ECW world title on this day in 1997? That was today's episode.
That's of course, I was a little ill prepared today. So I can tell you about today's episode. Today was a very, very in-depth look at a pay-per-view for ECW for a hometown boy. I'm not sure what you have prepared for us tomorrow.
New Japan launching New Japan World. So that'll be tomorrow. And then the TNA gimmick match that debuted in 2007 is the way we're going to close off the week. So
very nice.
So good stuff. All right. Definitely subscribe to the show, the audio show that's on Apple, Spotify, or whatever. And if we don't see you there, we'll see you back here next week for our next episode on Tales from the Territory.
See you.